All part of the plan. Totally had that planned and figured out. Hey, you might have noticed there was some new folks up here with us today. Jenna and Tim on the drums, Jenna up here, and they're actually visiting us from Nova Scotia. So Tim is a pastor at Woods Harbor Wesleyan Church in Nova Scotia. If you don't know where that is, it's way eastern Canada. So they drove very far to be here, and we're grateful that on their day off they decided to come and serve us. So let's just thank them for serving us. I waited tables for years in Nashville, Tennessee, and I quickly learned the value of growing in the art of small talk. Becoming good at small talk. I learned that, there were certain things that you could say that would endear you to your patrons, and certain things that would garner goodwill and eventually, hopefully, a good tip. There's always things you can talk about. You can talk to anybody about the weather, and people love talking about the weather. You can mention how cold it is, how hot it is, how it's too sunny out. I've heard that one before. You can talk about sports, and being in Nashville, we would talk about the Nashville Preds and the Tennessee Titans. But then there's topics you don't talk about. At least not if you want to get a good tip. At least not if you want to gain some goodwill. People will tell you, don't talk about religion. Don't talk about politics. And most certainly, don't talk about your colonoscopy. I may or may not have overheard a server doing this and engaging a table with us. Can you imagine? You go in for a nice meal, and right before you get the appetizers and the drinks, the server says, you ask him, how are you doing? He says, well, I just had a colonoscopy, and then goes on to tell you in graphic detail, complete with pictures, on that colonoscopy. That's not how you do small talk. And you guys know this, right? Like, when somebody actually asks you how you're doing, that's not usually an invitation to actually tell them how you're doing. That's not the invitation to say, well, my kids aren't sleeping, my dog keeps peeing on the floor, I just had my colonoscopy. You get the point. Colonoscopies are not a good method of small talk. Small talk is an art form. It's an art form, and to engage in good small talk, you have to share just enough to entertain people, just enough to impress them, but not so much that you sound like you're bragging. You got to talk about topics that are interesting, that are neutral, that won't offend anybody, but are still interesting to engage with over conversation. You can share a little bit of your vulnerabilities, a little bit of your weaknesses, but not so much that you sound needy or you sound desperate. It's an art form, isn't it? Small talk. And undoubtedly, this art form, or maybe a negative art form of small talk, it's a greater symptom of a bigger problem in our culture. And that's this, that we are experts at staying in the shallow end of relationships. We are experts at wading in the shallow waters of relationships with others, and we're amateurs at going into deep relationships. Just take your social media accounts, for example. You've got a number of friends, probably hundreds, probably thousands. They wish you happy birthday once a year. They kind of know roughly what's going on in your life, but how many of those people do you call when you're in crisis? How many of those people do you have to call on when you face sickness or emotional distress or mental health issues? We happen to be experts in the area of shallow relationships, but we're amateurs when it comes to deep relationships. And this can cause a problem, especially in churches. Because what can happen is churches they can become really proficient in the shallow end of relationships. Really good at staying in the shallow waters. You've probably walked in the doors of a church like this before. You walk in and everybody's smiling. Everybody's life is going great. You ask them how they're doing. Their kids are in Ivy League schools. Their dog takes itself out to the bathroom. They haven't had a colonoscopy in years. Life is so good for those people. I'll let the colonoscopy go. The thing is, we're experts at the shallow areas of relationships. And what can happen in a church setting is this creates a false utopia where everybody has everything together, where everybody is living their best life without any problems or any fears. And the truth is, and Dwayne reminded me of this years ago, that the hospital or the church is not a museum for the saints, it's a hospital for the sick. The church is not a museum for the saints, it's a hospital for the sick. And what can happen is when we create this false utopia, when we are experts in the shallow end of relationships, not the deep end of relationships, of sharing vulnerabilities, of going deep in meaningful community, we can become isolated. So how do you become a hospital for the sick, though? Like, what do you do as a church? What changes can you make as individuals to actually get to that space where you truly are a place where the broken in the community feel welcome and feel loved and feel seen and feel like this is a safe place? To answer that question, we're going to be looking at the book of Ruth, and we're actually in a brand new sermon series on the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth is a great book. It is filled with cultural nuance, and it's really a short 4 chapters. It's something you could read tomorrow for your devotionals. In fact, I'd encourage you, as we go along in this series, to read the book of Ruth a few times as we work through it. I think you'll find something new every time you open the pages. But to quote Shakespeare, though she be but small, she is fierce. There is a lot happening in the book of Ruth. It's dense. And as we really take the time to understand what's happening culturally and peel back the layers of this passage of Scripture, I think we're going to find that it's not just a nice story about 2 friends traveling to Israel, but it's a dynamic theological story that has big implications for you and I today. We're going to be opening to Ruth chapter 1. I'm reading out of the NRSV version, and we'll also have it on the screen for you as well. It says this in Ruth chapter 1, verse 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. Now I want to pause there because this is a bit ironic, because the actual Hebrew term Bethlehem means house of bread. And on the other side of that, Moab are their disdained enemies, the enemies of Israel. And so here you have these Israelites leaving the house of bread to travel to enemy territory for safety and for security. Theologian Alphanetta Wines writes, reference to Moab is a reminder that Moabites are part of Abraham's extended family descended from the incestuous union of Lot and his daughters. Israel's disdain for these extended family members can be seen in Deuteronomy 23:3, where Ammonites and Moabites were excluded from the assembly for 10 generations. So his family leaves the house of bread, the safety and security of Israel, to travel to enemy territory. Verse 2 says, the name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem. I had to practice that a few times. I still botched it. From Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her sons, 2 sons, and her husband. So tragedy strikes not once, but twice, and no parent should ever have to bury their child. You can imagine how devastating this would have been for their family. On top of that, there are 2 women in a patriarchal society. And these women, they can't go out and get jobs. They certainly can't own any land or have a house. They don't even have any life insurance to help cushion them through the grieving period. They're in a tough spot. And so Naomi does the only reasonable thing, given that she's in enemy territory. She decides to go back to the house of bread, back to her homeland. And this is what it says. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had returned in the country of Moab For she had heard the country of Moab, that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. And then partway through the trip, she turns to her daughters-in-law and says this, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you in the house of your husband." In other words, go back home. Mary, you're still young. You can have a chance at a family, at a house, at security, at safety. You can build a new life for yourself. Just go home. Go back to the safety of Moab. And Orpah does this. It says, "Then she kissed them and they wept aloud. And they said to her, 'No, we will return with you to your people.' But Naomi said, 'Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Do you still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord is turned against me.' And then they wept aloud again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law goodbye, but Ruth clung to her." And this is remarkable, because there's not a whole lot in this for Ruth. She's a Moabite. She's viewed as Israel's enemy, and she's going to travel as a single widowed woman to enemy territory with Naomi. She has every chance in the world to go and rebuild her life, but even though Naomi tries to persuade her otherwise, she still goes. Naomi says this, "Look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you. Do not turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do thus to me and more as well, if even death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. What I love about this story is that if you really put yourself in the Israelites' shoes, who would have been hearing this story for the first time and would have been reading it, you can understand just how much tension there would have been in reading this. Here you have Ruth, a Moabite woman, an enemy of Israel, and here you have a widowed Israelite with no hope for her future, going together, breaking down the walls of racism and prejudice that existed in Israel that day. This story would have been a challenge for every single Israelite hearing this. This relationship that they form and the way they journey together, it echoes the picture of the kingdom of heaven as it was intended. It echoes Revelation 7:9, which says this, "I looked and behold a great multitude that no one could number, from every nation, from all tribes and peoples and languages, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes with palm branches in their hands, crying out with a loud voice, 'Salvation belongs to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb.'" The kingdom of heaven is not monochromatic. It is a rich tapestry made of every tribe, every tongue, every nation, and every skin color. And this passage of Scripture, it is a direct challenge not only to the Israelites of that day, it's a challenge to us to break down the barriers of social stigma, to work together to show that there is a better way. The kingdom is beautifully diverse. And you might say, "Oh, that sounds great, but how do we get to that point?" How do we get to that point like Ruth and Naomi where they're working together and they're going out and they're wading through the waters of grief and prejudice and hardship? I think we have to be willing to wade into deep waters of deep relationship. We have to get out of the shallow end of the water when it comes to relationships. I was reading the other day from Acts chapter 27, which is the story of Paul being shipwrecked in the middle of a terrible storm. And Paul gave the captain a warning. He said, "The waters are going to be really rough. We should probably stay back." But the captain, being the seasoned captain he was, insisted that they push out into the sea. So sure enough, they go out and they encounter a nor'easter. And this nor'easter, it is very dangerous. It's pushing them across the Adriatic Sea. The boat is almost sinking daily. They're throwing over food and supplies overboard just to keep the boat afloat. And after about 2 weeks of being out in the deep waters and the treacherous sea, they notice that the water is getting a little bit more shallow. And you would think that this would be something that brought them hope, that this would be exciting for them. It means they're close to land, but the seasoned sailors knew they were heading for even more dangerous waters. You see, as they got to more shallow waters, they knew that there were shoals, there were coral, there were sandbars that could wreck their ship before they even got to land. And so the sailors actually try to escape at one point when nobody's looking. You know, they try to jump in the ship, the lifeboats, and drop down, and the soldiers cut the lines, and they make it through the night, and that next morning they can see land off in the distance. And they make a decision. They're going to make a break for it. They hoist the foresail, they go against the shallows, and they make a break. They're hoping they can just ride up onto the beach with the boat when suddenly they're stuck on a sandbar. The wind and waves are just crushing the boat. I mean, tearing it piece by piece. People are fearing for their lives, and they're able to get out and just barely make it onto shore safely. And as I was studying this book of Ruth and Acts 27, and simultaneously thinking about our culture and our expertise in shallow relationships, I couldn't help but see the correlation. You know, any seasoned captain will tell you that the shallow end looks as though it's safer because you're closer to land, but it's not actually safer. It's more dangerous. And this is why. Because it can isolate you and it can prevent you from movement. It can get you trapped on a sandbar. It can get you trapped on a piece of coral such that you're subject to the beating of the wind and the waves, and there's no escape. See, it may feel safer to engage in the shallow part of relationships. You know, the small talk, the niceties, the mutual exchange of hellos and occasional Facebook messages to wish a happy birthday. It may feel safer that way, but it's not actually safer. Because the longer we wait in those waters of shallow relationship, the more isolated and alone we become. The more isolated we get from those who are truly there to help us. Sorry, I didn't plan on this. So we got to do that awkward, chin microphone thing. You know, relationally, we settle for small talk. We want to exchange pleasantries and niceties, but we don't want to wade into deeper waters of vulnerability, of sharing our hardship, of sharing with a trusted group of friends that we're not really doing okay. We seek safety and refuge in relationships with people who are similar to us and have similar backgrounds to us, instead of wading into the waters of learning about other people and learning about cultural differences. We struggle because it feels so uncomfortable to share that we're broken. We internally fear that someone might judge us or condemn us. But just like any captain will tell you, the shallows are not safer. They will isolate you. They will keep you alone. And if you're not careful, you can get stuck there. I've asked Stephen to come forward and help me with an illustration here. Can you guys give a hand for Stephen? Stephen, you can come over here. Do me a favor, put that backpack on and just leave it open. You look like you're ready for school. You feel ready for school? No, not so much. Fair enough. Neither am I. You know, I see so many people who come into the doors of this church. So many people go into so many churches, and they're just carrying heavy loads with them. And they're walking in, and they've got this heavy load. They've got this heavy load of grief. And they're trying to carry it on their own. You know, someone passed away, a day ago, weeks ago, months ago, years ago, and it's like everybody has moved on but you, and you feel like you have to shoulder that load. You have to carry it all by yourself. And so you walk in and you pretend like everything's okay, and it's heavy. It weighs you down. And then you have people here, you're struggling with your mental health. You've got struggles with anxiety and worry and depression. It's like you feel like, I'll just keep this to myself. I'll figure this out on my own. I can work through this. I can come out on the other side. And you're isolated. And you're alone. And it's this heavy, heavy burden that you have to carry all by yourself. He told me he could go up to 160 pounds, so. And then, you have people here who you just feel lonely. And loneliness is a heavy burden to carry. You feel like you're alone in your marriage or in your family life. You feel like you don't have any real deep friends who can walk beside you. And you walk in and you pretend like everything's okay, but it's a heavy burden to bear on your own. And you have people who come in and you've got sin in your life, and maybe it's habitual. Maybe it's just something you can't seem to break. And you've been trying, but doing it on your own, it's not working. And you feel so filled with shame and so filled with guilt. And it's just like you're walking in with all this stuff, and it's getting heavier and heavier. And some of you maybe you're in addiction recovery, and you're trying, and every day is a difficult day, and it's like it's just getting heavier and heavier to carry on your own, so much so that it feels like your back might break. Sorry, I'm just like tossing you around here. I don't think this bag can hold the weight anymore, and that's okay. Maybe that's an illustration in and of itself. What would be crazy? It would be crazy if I said, for the sake of this physical demonstration, for this physical illustration, I zipped up the backpack and I said, Stephen, you got to walk around like that for the rest of the day. Like you're interacting with people, and I threw a couple more rocks in there, so it's like 170 pounds. And I said, dude, you've got to walk around this whole week like that. You got to carry it with you everywhere you go, when you go to the grocery store, if you go to school, if you go to a friend's house, when you lay down in bed. You've got to be wearing that backpack, and you've got to carry that heavy load. You don't actually have to do that. That's not part of the illustration. Can you guys give Stephen a hand? You can just drop it off your shoulders here. You would think it's so crazy to have someone walk around with that heavy load on their shoulders and on their chest. But this is what you and I do so often. Is we walk in and we've got this heavy load on our chest. Thanks, Mark. Very intuitive. We walk in and we've got this heavy load on our chest. We've got this thing that's just weighing us down. And we would say to anybody else, well, you shouldn't have to shoulder that on your own. Like, you shouldn't be carrying this heavy load of burdens on your own. And so why do we feel like we need to be the ones to shoulder it? Why do we have to feel like we need to do it alone? We're isolated and we're alone. And then I read this passage of Ruth, and the safe thing for Ruth would have been to carry the burden alone, and for Naomi to carry the burden alone. For Ruth, it would have been to return home, to marry, to play it safe. Not to journey with a widowed Israelite into enemy territory where she'd face scorn and rejection and racism and prejudice. In the story of Ruth, it's so beautiful because Ruth and Naomi, they model this commitment to walk with one another through grief, through heartache, through mourning, and through loss. And what a beautiful picture that is for us of the church today. Not trying to carry the burden on our own or shoulder the load on our own, but individuals walking side by side through the heartaches of life, shouldering each other's burdens, comforting one another in grief and loss. The church is not supposed to be a museum for saints. The church is a hospital for the sick. And I just wonder what would happen here if we took that mandate seriously. And we decided to wade into the deep waters of relationship, of vulnerability, of honesty, of getting plugged in with small groups, with mentors, with people around us who can walk beside us through the hardships of life. What could happen here at City Hope? What chains of addiction could break? What sin could be eradicated? What anxiety and depression could be challenged head on, not just from one person, but a group of people? What prayers would be answered by us coming together in unity and shouldering one another's burdens? Can you imagine that as we did this over time, what people would say about us? You know, someone would be struggling with grief and hardship, and they'd go, you know, I know you're really struggling. There's this church over on Long Pond Road. If you go there, they'll walk beside you. They won't leave you alone. Can you imagine if someone was struggling with anxiety and depression and they didn't know where to turn, they'd say, you know, there's this church I know of. It's right by Lions Park. You can go over there, and there's people there that deeply love you and deeply care for you. And they won't make you walk on your own. They'll walk beside you. Can you imagine the change that we could bring about in our community just by simply partnering together in the ministry of God? And then what a privilege it would be to have people walk through our doors, the hurting, the broken, and the sick, and be able to point them to Jesus, to the resurrected Savior who has died for them in their brokenness and in their pain and sees them and deeply cares about their trauma, deeply cares about what they're experiencing. Can you imagine the change that could happen in our community simply by walking with one another and journeying into deep relational waters? You might think, I'm on board with that, but where do I begin? Do I just find someone and just unload all my stuff right here and now? I think it takes time to get there. We have to meet with people regularly. We have to find trusted individuals to shoulder our burdens together with. But I want to give you two very tangible take-homes today. Two very tangible take-homes. One, we have a prayer list that Gail Means has organized and sends out on a daily basis often. If there's a need in our community, that prayer gets sent out to about 100 or so people. And I personally appreciate that Gail does this so much because it allows me just to stop what I'm doing and to pray over those prayer requests as they come in. And so I would challenge you, first and foremost, join that prayer list. Receive those emails and commit to lifting each other up in prayer on a daily and a weekly basis. I mean, can you imagine that? Like, as you submit a prayer request, can you imagine every single person in this room stopping what they're doing and praying for you? What a beautiful, beautiful picture that would be. I want to encourage you, if you have not signed up for that, sign up for it. We've got these new cards on your chairs, and there's one card in particular that says, we will pray for you. And I want to encourage you to write down your email on that prayer card and pass it into the bin at the back. And if you're not signed up for that prayer list, we will get you signed up with it this week, and we'll get you plugged into the daily and the weekly prayer requests as they come through. And number two, as we get ready for a time of communion, and I want to invite the worship team forward during this time, as we get ready for a time of communion, I want to challenge us to truly be a people of prayer. Not just on the weekly email, but I want to make sure that everybody knows that this altar is available to you each and every week, and it's available to you this week. And there are some of you who are here who you're experiencing brokenness and pain, and there's just stuff going on in your life, and you need prayer. And I want to challenge you as you come and receive communion to be willing to wade into those deep waters of vulnerability, to come forward and pray. And then I want to challenge you, if you're not one of those persons that come forward today, I want to challenge you with this. It shouldn't just be the pastors that are walking up to lay hands on the people who need prayer each week. It shouldn't. I deeply love praying over each person. I count it a privilege to lay my hands on somebody and to pray over them. But we should be a church where when someone comes up for prayer, it's not unusual to see 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 people surrounding them and praying for them. I want to challenge you today, as you see people come forward and kneel for prayer, to step out of your comfort zone, to come and lay your hands on them and pray for them. And let's not just make this a one-time thing, something we just do on this Sunday, but let's make this a thing moving forward. that we are a people of prayer, that we lift up the burdens of one another. And as you venture into deep waters, I think here's what you're going to find. That God has plans for your life and plans for each individual here that are beyond what you can imagine. God has a rich love for you exactly where you're at. Even if you feel broken, even if you feel alone, God sees you. May we be a church that is not just experts in the shallow areas of relationships, but deeply crave and dive deep into relational waters, loving one another, lifting up each other in prayer.